I'm Evelynn. I came home to silence, not the comforting kind that greets you after a long day, but the kind that sits heavy on your chest and whispers things you are not ready to hear, the kind of silence that tells you nothing will ever be the same again. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the house I had grown up in. It felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had just become too big for the memories that lived inside its walls. The flag was at half-mast, and that was the only sign that someone important had been lost. My father was gone, and no one seemed to know what to say about it. I had been away for 9 months, deployed overseas, running operations that left no room for emotion or personal thoughts. Everything about my days had been measured, efficient, and controlled, and now I stood in the driveway of the house where I had once learned how to ride a bike, where I had broken my arm falling from the apple tree, where I had said goodbye to my father before boarding the plane that took me away from everything familiar. I stared at the front door for a long time, not sure what would be waiting for me on the other side. When I finally stepped in, the air smelled the same faintly of old wood and lemon polish, and something else that reminded me of late nights and whispered arguments. My mother sat in the living room, her eyes red and tired, but her posture still rigid. She didn't hug me, she didn't say she missed me, she only nodded as if I had never really been gone. And maybe in her mind I hadn't. Maybe I was still that teenage girl who had shouted she would never come back, and yet here I was, not for her, not for reconciliation, but for a funeral. Me brother Nathan was already there, of course, sitting in our father's old armchair, legs crossed, one hand resting on the side of his face as if he were bored, not grieving. He looked at me, and something flickered in his expression, something I couldn't name yet but would come to recognize as disdain. He stood up, offered a weak smile, said something I didn't hear, and walked into the kitchen as if the sight of me exhausted him. It had always been like that between us ever since we were children. He resented how our father praised my strength, my discipline, the way I never backed down. Even as a girlie walked through the house, slowly taking in every corner, every faded photograph, every scratch on the hardwood floor, they were all frozen in time. Nothing had changed except everything. My father wasn't there, and his absence was louder than his voice had ever been. I stopped in front of his study. The door was half open. Inside, the desk was cleared, the books too neatly stacked, and I knew Nathan had already been in there, probably more than once, probably hours after our father passed. The funeral was small and impersonal. A few neighbors, a couple of old military friends, people who knew him more by title than by heart. I stood by the casket, my uniform freshly pressed and my posture straight and unyielding, and I wondered what he would think if he saw me like this, the daughter who had inherited his discipline but never quite earned his approval, the daughter who had spent more time with strangers in uniform than with her own blood. I didn't cry, not then, not when they lowered the casket, not when the dirt hit the wood, not even when my mother whispered something I couldn't catch through her tears. Back at the house, the mood was strange. People were talking about weather and taxes and grocery prices as if they hadn't just buried a man who had held this family together with nothing but force of will and quiet authority. I found Nathan outside, smoking near the garden where our father used to spend his Sunday mornings. He looked relaxed, too relaxed, and that flicker of something I couldn't name returned in full force. He asked me how long I planned to stay, and I told him I didn't know, maybe a week, maybe more, depending on what needed to be handled. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my old room, surrounded by trophies and posters I had left behind, like pieces of someone else's life. I thought about my father and the last conversation we had. It had been brief, something about duty and sacrifice, and how some things matter more than comfort. I remembered how tired he sounded and how I had promised I would visit once the deployment ended, and now he was gone and I had kept nothing of that promise. I wondered if he had been disappointed in the end, or if he had understood that I had become who I was because of him. Next morning, I started going through the documents, the will, the house deeds, the insurance papers, everything that death turns into paperwork. My father had always been meticulous, and yet things were missing. Small things at first, like receipts or signed letters, but then bigger things like the original copy of the will, the one he had told me he would leave in the safe. I checked the safe in his study. The Combination still the same, and inside were only a few old medals and a photograph of us when I graduated from basic training. Nothing else. I asked Nathan if he had seen the will, and he said our father had rewritten it months ago and had left everything to him because he had stayed behind, because he had taken care of things while I was off playing soldier. He said it with a smile, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. I didn't argue, not yet, because I knew how this worked. Emotions clouded judgment, and judgment was the only thing I had left that I could trust. I visited the family lawyer, and he confirmed that there was a new will signed and witness leaving the house, the accounts, and even the land upstate to Nathan. I asked when it had been signed, and he told me 2 months before our father died, when I was still deployed and unreachable. Something about it didn't make sense, not the timing, not the content, not the way my father would suddenly change everything without a single word to me. He wasn't sentimental, but he wasn't unfair. Ethery began to dig, not with shovels but with memory, with routine, with observation. I started watching Nathan, listening to him, noticing the way he avoided certain topics, the way he got irritated when I stayed up late reading through documents, the way he laughed too loudly when my mother brought up old stories. I kept my uniform pressed, my movements precise, and my questions casual, and I could feel the edges of something unraveling just beneath the surface. One night, I found a folder buried in a locked drawer in the garage. Inside were copies of letters my father had written but never sent, drafts of a will with my name on it, and receipts for meetings with a different attorney, not the one who had filed the current will. Dates matched the timeline when Nathan claimed our father had fallen ill, too sick to think clearly, but these documents showed a man who had been planning something deliberate, something Ferry didn't confront Nathan, not yet. Instead, I made copies and stored them in a secure location. I reached out to contacts from the army, lawyers, investigators, people who knew how to track inconsistencies in paper trails, and within days I had what I needed. The signature on the new will didn't match any of my father's previous ones, and the witnesses were friends of Nathan's, not legal professionals. One of them had even been arrested years ago for forgery. Sat alone in the dark that night, the documents spread out in front of me, and for the first time I allowed myself to feel not just anger but betrayal, the kind of betrayal that cracks something inside you, the kind that doesn't just hurt, it reshapes you. I thought about my father, about the life he had built, and how it was being dismantled by someone who shared his name but not his values. I thought about justice and what it meant when blood made justice harder, not easier, and I knew then what I had to do. I started my mornings earlier than anyone else. The way I had been trained to do. Years of military discipline meant I didn't need alarms or reminders. I woke up with the sun, made black coffee without sugar, and stepped out into the backyard to think. The garden looked like a battlefield, flowers pulled from their roots, weeds spreading like unchecked lice, things that used to be beautiful now stripped of care, and I realized how long it must have been since anything had been tended to. Harami Mother barely spoke to me anymore. She moved through the house like a shadow, pausing only to refill her teacup or to rearrange things that didn't need rearranging. She didn't ask about the will or my plans or why I spent hours in my father's study. I didn't blame her, not exactly. Grief takes people differently, and I knew she had never understood me, not really, not since I joined the army, not since I stopped being the version of her daughter she wanted. Nathan was louder now, more comfortable. He played music in the afternoons, walked through the house like he owned it. Sometimes I caught him smiling to himself as if the battle was already over and he had won, but I kept my steps quiet, my words few. I needed him to believe that I was grieving, not scheming. I needed him to think I was still lost in memories, not following a trail that led directly to him. He started visiting the county clerk's office, asking for copies of property transfers, old land ownership records, and anything with my father's signature on it. The clerks were helpful, though confused, probably wondering why a soldier in uniform cared so much about paperwork. I told them it was for estate clarity, and they accepted that answer without pushing it too far. I had learned how to lie with my tone, not my words, a skill the army had sharpened into instinct. Matched the dates on the fake will with Nathan's credit card records, which I obtained from a contact who owed me a favor. It showed him at a notary office 2 towns over the same day. The new will had supposedly been signed by our father, except my father had been in the hospital that week undergoing a minor procedure, a kind that required sedation and rest, which meant he couldn't have possibly been at any office signing anything official. The witnesses listed on the document were even easier to discredit. One of them had moved out of state the year before, the other had an active warrant for identity theft and no listed employment. I cross-referenced their names with old photographs and social media accounts. The faces didn't match, and one signature looked like it had been written by a child trying to imitate cursive. My father's signature was distinct, clean, and practiced. This was Nethery sent the entire folder to a former military paralegal now working in civilian fraud investigation. She reviewed everything and called me after 3 days. Her voice was calm, but I could tell she was impressed. This isn't just suspicious, she said. This is textbook forgery. Whoever did this was sloppy, but confident, probably assumed no one would question it, especially not someone out of the country. For nearly a year I thanked her and hung up my hands, resting on the papers, my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. I knew I had enough to build a case, enough to start the process that would tear Nathan's little empire down, but something held me back. Not fear, not hesitation, but something else deeper. I needed to understand why he did it, not just how, because once I crossed the line into confrontation, there would be no going back, and I had to be sure I wasn't missing something that might explain it. Also, I watched him. I shadowed his movements the way I had been trained to do. I listened at night when he thought I was asleep. I followed him one afternoon when he drove to a small bank downtown and met with a woman I didn't recognize. They exchanged something over the table, documents, envelopes. I took photos from across the street, zoomed in until I could read the logo on the papers. They were from a trust office, the kind that handled assets hidden from family eyes. He wasn't just claiming the house or the money in our father's accounts, he was transferring assets into a separate entity under his name. He was erasing me from the family legacy step by careful step, and he didn't even look over his shoulder once, not even as he left the bank and whistled his way back to the car. I realized then that he truly believed I wouldn't fight back, that I was still the little sister, too honorable to break rules, too disciplined to get dirty. That night, I stood outside his room and listened to him talk on the phone. He spoke in low tones, smug, full of certainty. Yeah, she's here, but she's not gonna do anything. She's still all military, like she's in shock or something. Thinks Dad wanted it this way. It's perfect. He paused, laughed, said something about getting the land appraised next week and how soon he'd be ready to sell. I walked away before I could hear the rest because it didn't matter. I had heard and knew. He drove to the courthouse the next morning and requested a hearing to challenge the validity of the will. I submitted the forged signature analysis, the false witness records, and the hospital admission notes that proved my father had been incapable of signing anything that week. It was a start, not a guarantee, but it opened the door to investigation, and once that door opened, Nathan would no longer be in control of the narrative. He didn't know, yet I didn't tell him. I kept my face neutral, my tone soft. I made breakfast and joined him on the porch when he smoked, asked if he needed help sorting Dad's belongings, and he waved me off, said he had it covered, and I smiled just enough to keep his guard down. My strength was never in confrontation, it was in precision, in timing, and now that the clock had started ticking, I had no intention of stopping. I began preparing my testimony, reviewing legal procedures, talking to advisors, and building a strategy as if I were planning a mission, which in many ways I was. This wasn't just about winning a court case, it was about restoring something that had been taken from me, something intangible but deeply personal. I wanted my father's truth to be heard and my brother's betrayal to be seen for what it was. In the evenings, I returned to the garage and read old letters my father had written, notes he had left for himself, things that showed who he truly was, not the man Nathan was trying to erase, but the one who believed in structure, fairness, and legacy. And I promised him silently that I would not let his story be rewritten by someone who only understood greed. The storm was coming, and I had spent my life learning how to move in storms, not avoid them. I started counting the days, not because I was impatient, but because I needed rhythm, routine, something to hold on to while the legal wheels turned slowly, without emotion, without urgency. Every morning I woke up at the same time, sat in the same chair, In the kitchen, watched the same sun rise through the curtains and told myself I could wait as long as it took because waiting was something I had mastered over the years. Patience was a weapon and I was sharpening it with every quiet. Hornathan continued living like nothing was wrong, laughing at his phone, taking calls about landscaping renovations, property listings. He had already made an appointment with a realtor to come assess the house. He told my mother we might as well sell it since I didn't really live here, and she nodded like it made sense, like it had always been his house to decide over. Her detachment started to look like permission, and that was harder to stomach than I expected. I didn't argue with her. I didn't tell her about the hearing date or the documents or the forged names. She was already too far removed from reality, locked in a space where grief looked like silence and silence looked like surrender. Every time I tried to bring up the past, she changed the subject or left the room as if memory itself had become too dangerous to touch. So I stopped trying. I let her drift while I stayed grounded because someone had told him the envelope arrived with the court stamp on it. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it for a long time, thinking about what this meant, not just legally but personally. This was the beginning of the end of what was left of our family. The moment I filed those papers, I had chosen a side, and it wasn't blood, it was truth. I opened it slowly and read the date, the location, the assigned judge. All of it was real now, no longer just a plan in my head. He kept moving like nothing had changed because that was how survival worked in places where trust was dead. You don't show your hand until you're ready to play it. I went on runs every morning through the same neighborhoods we had biked through as kids past the school Nathan and I had walked to side by side before everything fractured, before we both became versions of ourselves that neither one of us recognized. Anna Marie thought about what my father would say if he were still here, and I realized I didn't know. Not really. Maybe he would tell me to stand down to avoid the shame. Maybe he would tell me to fight because justice matters more than appearances, but he wasn't here and I had to make decisions with the pieces he left behind and the silence he never broke. Nathan finally noticed something was different one evening when he found me reviewing folders in the study. He raised an eyebrow, asked if I was trying to be the executor of something. I smiled and said nothing, but I could tell he didn't like the stillness in my face. He was used to me being controlled but passive, quiet but obedient. Now my silence had shape, purpose, weight, and it made him nervous even if he couldn't say why. Night before the hearing I barely slept. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, counting every breath, every heartbeat, reminding myself why I started this and what I would lose if I didn't see it through. My hands stayed steady, my thoughts clear, and I remembered the cold barracks, the loud drills, the days when failure meant consequences far worse than disappointment. This was different, but not unfamiliar, a mission like any other, only this time the enemy shared. My last Mammoth courthouse smelled like dust and old carpet and things people were trying to forget. I walked through the metal detector in full uniform, not because I had to, but because I wanted the room to see me the way my father used to see me, disciplined, sharp, and immovable. Nathan arrived late, wearing sunglasses and chewing gum like he was on his way to a casual meeting, not a legal hearing that could strip him of everything he thought he owned. The judge asked basic questions. My lawyer spoke with precision. The documents were presented one by one, the signatures, the false witnesses, the hospital records, each detail laid out with surgical clarity. Nathan didn't speak much. He sat still. For the first time since this all began, his face twitching slightly every time another lie was exposed. I didn't look at him, not once, because this wasn't about him. It was about what was right. Me mother didn't come. She said she couldn't handle the drama, said we were tearing each other apart over something that couldn't be undone. I told her I understood, but I didn't, not really, because silence in the face of wrong was never neutral. It was complicity. She had chosen peace over truth, and I couldn't follow her there, not this time. When the session ended, the judge ordered a freeze on all property transactions until the matter was resolved. Nathan stormed out of the building without looking at me, and I stayed behind to file more paperwork to make everything official. I had learned long ago that justice doesn't reward emotion, it rewards persistence, and I had plenty of that left. Back at the house, the mood had changed. Nathan no longer smiled in the kitchen. He Avoided eye contact, spoke only when necessary, slammed doors when he thought I wasn't listening. The tension was a physical thing, heavy and sharp like metal in the air. My mother stayed in her room more often, and I let her. Maybe it was easier that way, maybe some wounds healed better in the dark. He continued building the case, reviewing more bank records, finding older documents from years ago when our father had first drafted his original will, long before any sickness, before Nathan started visiting lawyers in secret. I found emails printed and folded, hidden in the back of a drawer, where my father had listed instructions about dividing the estate equally, about fairness, about family, and it made me feel something close to vindication. But I wasn't finished, not yet. There were still gaps in the timeline, inconsistencies I couldn't explain, and I needed to close them all, because people like Nathan operated in the spaces between details and the cracks between versions of the truth. He was good at pretending, not just to others but to himself, and I needed more than evidence. I needed certainty. So I went back to the bank, the one where he had met that woman, and I requested a meeting under the pretense of updating an account. Once inside, I asked casual questions, brought up my father's name, and watched their reactions. I mentioned the trust, and the woman's face stiffened slightly, only for a second, but enough for me to know I had found another piece of the puzzle. She didn't answer my questions directly, but what she didn't say spoke louder than what she did back at home. I confronted the safe again, this time not just for documents but for patterns where things had been removed, what was left behind, the dust. Outlines told stories of folders no longer their boxes that had been shifted, papers selectively taken. The absences were clues, and they told me what Nathan was trying to erase, what he feared I might find. And now I was close. I could feel it, the way you feel a storm before it breaks, and the pressure of the air and the silence before thunder. Wasn't just following breadcrumbs anymore. I was drawing a map, and at the center of it was a man who had mistaken my silence for surrender, and I was ready to show him how wrong he had been. There is a silence that settles in after battle, not the relief of victory or the sting of defeat, but the hollow stillness of waiting for the next strike. I lived in that space for days, moving through the house like a ghost, inhabiting familiar rooms with unfamiliar tension. My footsteps felt louder, the walls thinner, a weight of what I had started pressing down on every breath I took. The court hearing was only the beginning, and I knew that what came next would be messier, more personal, more dangerous. Nathan barely spoke to me now, his smiles gone, his swagger replaced with short, clipped movements and a constant tapping of his fingers against the kitchen counter, like he was counting down to something he still believed he could control. I watched him the way I used to watch suspicious vehicles on patrol, slow, steady, scanning for shifts in rhythm, for sudden changes in direction. He was trying to regroup, to fix whatever holes I had already punched in his story, but he didn't know how many more I was ready to make. Neighbors started whispering. I could feel their eyes when I walked down the driveway. Their voices dropped to murmurs when I passed by, the kind of quiet judgment reserved for scandals that touched old families in quiet towns. I ignored it. I had dealt with worse than whispers. I had stood through fire drills and enemy fire and commanding officers who wanted me broken. I wasn't going to flinch at gossip, not now, not after everything I had uncovered. Already spent my days combing through more files, more bank statements, more emails. I pulled receipts from storage units and found evidence of purchases that made no sense. Gardening supplies for a house with no garden, high-end electronics that never arrived, strange wire transfers to accounts listed under shell corporations. It wasn't just about the will anymore. It wasn't just about the house or the money. My brother had built an entire system of lies, and the will was just one piece of it. I contacted a financial crimes investigator who had worked with military intelligence, someone who owed me a favor and had a reputation for seeing patterns others missed. I gave her everything I had, and she sent me a report that made my blood run cold. Nathan hadn't just forged a will, he had been embezzling small amounts from our father's accounts for years, hidden under medical expenses, renovations, consulting fees. It was slow and careful and designed to be invisible, but it was through sat in the dark that night, the report in my lap, and tried to understand how deep it went, how long he had been planning this, if he had ever felt guilt, if he had ever looked our father in the eye and still gone through with it, or If maybe he had convinced himself he deserved it all because he had stayed behind, because he had played the good son while I was away doing something he could never understand, the thought made me sick. I started sleeping less, not from fear, but from focus. I couldn't turn it off my mind, constantly running scenarios, building timelines, connecting dots. I woke up at 3 in the morning to write down dates that suddenly made sense, found myself muttering old addresses while making coffee. Every detail mattered now, and I couldn't risk forgetting any of it because I knew the next court session would be different. This time I wouldn't just be challenging a document, I would be exposing a personality. Tension in the house broke one evening when my mother finally asked me to leave. She didn't say it with anger or hatred, just quiet fatigue. She said this house had become a battlefield and she couldn't stand the sound of war anymore. She said I was tearing what little was left of the family apart, and maybe she was right, maybe I was, maybe there was no way to uncover the truth without breaking everything around it. But I didn't apologize. I packed my things and left that night. Not because I was giving up, but because I needed distance to breathe, to think, to build the final stages of my plan. I moved into a small rental apartment downtown, close to the courthouse, close to my lawyer, close to the records I still needed to collect. The space was empty, clean, quiet, and it reminded me of deployments, sterile rooms where everything had a purpose and nothing was sentimental. From there, I began reconstructing the full picture of what Nathan had done. I traced the embezzled funds to offshore accounts listed under aliases he had used in college. I tracked land that had been transferred to business entities he controlled on paper but not in name. I pulled emails where he discussed selling parcels of our family property without ever mentioning it to anyone, not even our father. The scale of it stunned me, not just the money, but the betrayal, the calculation. I realized then that he hadn't just stolen from our father, he had erased him, turned him into a tool, a signature on a form, a name on a deed. He had stripped away the man and left behind an asset, and I couldn't let that stand, not as a daughter, not as a soldier, not as someone who still believed in consequences. I met with my lawyer and presented everything, and he told me it was enough, not just for probate court but for a full criminal case. Didn't feel relief, I felt purpose. I felt the sharp, cold edge of justice moving closer, and I welcomed it with open hands. I knew what this would cost us as a family, what it would cost me as a sister, but it was never about revenge. It was about restoring something sacred, something honest, something that had been buried under years of deceit, and I would see it through no matter how ugly it got. Received notice that the judge had approved an evidentiary hearing. The next step before full legal proceedings, Nathan would be subpoenaed, the financial records examined publicly, the fraud charges outlined in clear, undeniable terms. The case was no longer a quiet family dispute, it was a legal assault, and I had brought the full weight of it down on him. I looked in the mirror that night and barely recognized myself, not because I had changed, but because I had stripped everything away, all the softness, all the hesitation, all the hope that this could be resolved quietly. What was left was clean, focused, and cold, and I didn't hate it. I understood it. I respected it. I had become exactly what this moment required, and Nathan still had no idea just how close he was to losing everything. There is a moment in every mission where silence turns to noise, where plans stop being ideas and become consequences. I felt that shift the morning Nathan called my phone 3 times in a row and left a message that started with confusion and ended in rage. He knew now not just that I was fighting him, but that I had built a case strong enough to threaten everything he thought was safe. The silence between us had shattered, and in its place was something raw and irreversible. I didn't answer his calls, I didn't return his messages. I let the facts speak louder than anything I could say. Words meant nothing to people like Nathan unless they were tied to power, to leverage, to gain, so I gave him none of mine. I stayed in my apartment, kept my head down, sharpened the details of the case like blades, and waited for the next hearing with the calm precision of someone trained not to panic in chaos but to move through it like water through stone. The hearing was set for Tuesday morning. The courthouse felt colder than before, the hallway lights too bright, the air too dry, the walls too close. I walked in wearing the same uniform I had worn to the first session, my boots polished, my spine straight, my breath even. Nathan was already There sitting at the table with his new attorney, a man with slicked back hair and a nervous smile who clearly hadn't read the full file or didn't believe it could all be truth. Judge entered and everything fell silent, not the respectful kind, but the heavy kind, the kind that sinks into skin and makes the room feel like it's holding its breath. Documents were submitted, witness lists confirmed, evidence entered into the record. I watched Nathan shift in his seat, his jaw tight, his eyes starting between pages like he was looking for an escape hatch, a hole in the timeline, a missing signature, anything that might make this go away. But there was nothing missing, not anymore. I had filled every gap, traced every transaction, proved every lie, the trust accounts, the forged signatures, the backdated transfers, the shell companies. Everything was mapped, dated, and verified. Nathan wasn't facing questions he could dodge, he was facing facts that couldn't be bent, and I saw it hit him, not all at once but piece by piece, like cold water rising slowly until you realize you're drowning. When the judge asked if I had anything to say, I stood slowly, took a breath, and spoke, not with anger, not with grief, but with clarity. I explained the pattern, the timeline, the damage, not just to finances, but to memory, to legacy, to trust. I didn't mention our childhood. I didn't talk about our father's smile or the way he used to sit by the window reading quietly while we played outside. This wasn't about emotion anymore, it was about truth. Nathan didn't speak, he just stared at the table as if it might collapse under the weight of what he had done. His lawyer tried to deflect, said the evidence was circumstantial, said the will had been changed with good intentions, said I had been gone too long to understand the context, but the words fell flat. Even the judge looked unimpressed, and I knew in that moment that I had turned the tide. The hearing ended with a formal review scheduled for the following week to determine criminal referral and property reversal. The judge instructed both parties to refrain from any financial activity or contact until then. Nathan walked past me outside the courtroom, his eyes empty, his mouth twisted into something that tried to be a smirk but failed. I didn't stop him, I didn't speak, I just watched him walk away carrying the weight he had created with hands that once belonged to my brother. Back at the apartment, I sat by the window for hours watching the city move without me, cars, headlights, reflections, people rushing through their lives unaware of the quiet war playing out in small courtrooms between siblings who used to share birthday cakes and fight over cereal. And I wondered when exactly we became enemies. Maybe it wasn't one moment, maybe it was a slow unraveling, a thread pulled here, a lie ignored there, until the whole thing came apart without either of us noticing. Started remembering things I hadn't thought about in years. The first time I beat Nathan in a race, the way he cried and refused to talk to me for hours, the day he broke our father's watch and blamed me and I took the punishment without protest, the way he used to leave his door open at night when he was scared and pretend it was because of the heat, the way I used to admire him until I realized admiration was a seed that didn't always grow into something good. He visited my father's grave that evening for the first time since the funeral. The cemetery was quiet, the grass trimmed, the stones cold and clean. I stood there in uniform with nothing to say and everything to feel. I didn't apologize, I didn't cry, I just stood still and let the silence be what it needed to be, not a void, but a space between endings and beginnings, between truth and reconciliation, between who I had been and who I was becoming. I left a folded piece of paper at the base of the headstone, a copy of the trust statement. Nathan had tried to bury proof that legacy was not so easily erased, and walked away without looking back, not because it didn't matter, but because I knew he would never read it, and that wasn't the point. The point was that I had found it, that I had brought it into the light, and that was enough. Next few days were a blur of calls, documents, consultations, interviews. The investigator I had hired uncovered more fraud going back years, small things at first, then bigger. Nathan had used our father's identity for a loan, had opened a line of credit in his name, had sold family property by forging power of attorney documents. The scope of it was staggering, not just in value but in intent. This wasn't an accident, this was a system. By Friday, the prosecutor had opened an inquiry and subpoenas were being prepared. Nathan was officially under investigation, and the look on his face when the notice was served was something I would never forget, not because It brought me joy, but because it brought him reality, cold, hard, and inescapable, the kind of reality he had spent years avoiding behind charm and confidence. And Lacey didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, grounded, ready for whatever came next. Because this wasn't the end, not yet. There were hearings to attend, records to correct, property to recover, but more than that, there was a truth to rebuild piece by piece, and I was the only one left who could do it because I had stayed quiet long enough, because I had watched long enough, because I had learned the difference between justice and revenge, and now I was choosing. The day of the final hearing arrived with quiet, not with fear or anticipation, just a steady calm that I had learned to trust over the years, the kind of calm that comes after months of watching, waiting, and knowing you have done everything you could do. I dressed like I had every other time, sharp, clean, controlled. I didn't look in the mirror for approval. I didn't need it anymore. I knew who I was, and that was enough. Courthouse was colder than before, or maybe I was just more aware of the weight of it, the way the walls carried echoes of every truth that had ever been buried and every lie that had ever been exposed. I walked through the metal detectors alone, no lawyer beside me, no supporters, just a file in my hand and clarity in my chest. I had learned long ago that most victories were earned in silence, not applause. Nathan was already inside, his face tight with something between anger and disbelief. His lawyer sat beside him, looking more tired than defiant, and I could tell the fight had drained from both of them. They hadn't expected me to last this long. They had underestimated what resolve looked like when it came from someone who had been trained to survive, not just win. The judge entered and began reading through the findings, the documents, the testimony, the fraud, the forged signatures, the bank accounts, the false witnesses, the abuse of legal trust. Each point landed with precision, clean, sharp, undeniable, and for the first time, Nathan didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even try to interrupt. The truth had caught him, and there was nowhere left to hide. If ruling was delivered in even tones, the fraudulent will was invalidated, the estate reverted to the original legal terms, assets were to be divided equally pending repayment of stolen funds. Nathan was found liable for civil fraud, and the matter was referred to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no outbursts, just the soft sound of papers being gathered and lives being rushed. PD left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. The air outside was colder than I expected, the sky overcast, the street quiet, and for a moment I just stood there, feeling the weight of everything I had carried begin to lift, not disappear, but shift enough for breath to come easier. My hands steady at my sides, not clenched, not shaking, just open. Back at the apartment, I sat on the floor and looked through old photos, the kind that don't age well because memory distorts them. Now I saw what I had missed before, not the smiles, but the spaces between them, not the hugs, but the tension in the shoulders. The stories we told ourselves about being a family were just that, stories, and now I had chosen to stop telling them. Mother called that evening. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew. Her voice was tired but clear. She said she needed time to understand what it all meant. I told her to take it. I didn't offer comfort or anger. I gave her the space she had never given me, and maybe that was the only kind of peace we were capable of. Now we returned to my father's study the next week. The house was quiet, almost unfamiliar. Nathan had moved out under court order, and the silence he left behind was cleaner than the one he had lived in. I opened the desk drawer one last time, ran my fingers along the edge of the empty safe, and closed it slowly, as if sealing something shut that had been left open far too long. The military offered me a new assignment overseas, high risk, high reward, something that required precision, focus, and solitude. Accepted without hesitation, not to escape but to begin again. The story was over, and I wasn't afraid of the next one because I had already faced the worst and made it through, not untouched but unbroken. On my last night in the apartment, I lit a candle and sat by the window, watching the lights of the city blink on one by one, each one a reminder that darkness isn't permanent, it bends eventually to persistence and time. I thought about everything I had learned, not just about Nathan but about myself, that silence can be powerful, that loyalty must be earned, and that justice is not given, it is built slowly, deliberately, and without apology. And I knew then that this was not just the end of a fight, it was the beginning of something better, not easier, not cleaner, but truer, and that was all I had ever really wanted. Thanks for listening to my story. Don't forget to follow and subscribe for more stories.